The doors to the Royal Northern Conservatory's main audition hall were heavy, made of a dark, polished wood that felt like a wall. A young woman stood before them, her hand resting lightly on the cool brass handle. Her name was Alara, and from the small, windswept town of Seaburn, everything about this place felt immense and silent, like a cathedral. The dress she wore was simple, a deep blue with tiny, almost invisible flowers along the collar. It was her best, bought from a charity shop on the high street last week with money she'd saved from mending fishing nets. She could still smell the salt air on her skin, she thought, a sharp, clean scent that felt utterly out of place here, where the air smelled of old paper, furniture polish, and a kind of dusty importance. Behind those doors was the thing she had worked for, dreamed of, for 10 years. Not in a fancy music room with a grand piano, but in the Seaburn Community Center, on an old upright piano that was donated in the 70s. The middle C key had a faint buzz, and the pedals squeaked, but to her, it was a spaceship. It was where she escaped the constant, grumbling soundtrack of her life, the crashing waves against the stone breakwater, the shouting of the fishermen at the dock, the low, constant thrum of the boatyard engines where she worked part-time after school. Her hands, resting at her sides, were not the smooth, delicate hands of the pianists in the magazines she collected. They were strong, with short, practical nails and a small, silver scar across the knuckle of her right thumb from a slip with a wire cutter. They were boatyard hands, but they knew the language of the keys. She took a slow breath, feeling the familiar, nervous flutter in her stomach. This was the preliminary audition for the senior scholarship, a single spot that covered everything. It was the only way someone from Seaburn could ever hope to step into this world. She'd practiced for this moment not for months, but for years. The piece she chose was by Franz Liszt, called La Campanella. It meant the little bell. It was a furious, beautiful, terrifying piece of music, full of wild jumps and trills and notes that sparkled like sunlight on water. Her teacher, a retired music professor who lived in a cottage by the lighthouse, had warned her. "It's a statement piece, Alara," he'd said, polishing his glasses. "The judges at these places, they hear it from prodigies in silk dresses who've had master classes since they were 5. They might think you're being ambitious." It was a word people in Seaburn used for someone who was getting above themselves, who looked past the horizon of the sea and wanted more. Alara knew what it meant. She also knew she had to play it. It was the only piece that held everything she felt: the storm, the calm, the glittering hope, the deep, resonant pull of the deep water. She pushed the door open. The hall was smaller than she'd imagined, but more intimidating. It wasn't a concert stage, just a large, quiet room with a high ceiling. At the far end, a magnificent grand piano gleamed under a single spotlight. In the shadows just beyond the light, a long table was set up. 3 figures sat behind it, silhouetted by the soft glow of desk lamps that illuminated piles of paper. "Candidate 147. State your name and piece, please." The voice came from the center, a man's voice, crisp and tired. Elara walked to the center of the floor, her shoes making a soft tap on the wooden floor. She could feel the eyes of the 3 judges on her, taking in the simple dress, the way her hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. "Alara Vance," she said, her voice clear but quiet in the big room. "I will be performing La Campanella by Franz Liszt." A beat of silence, then a sound. It was a soft, almost inaudible sigh from the judge on the right, the one in the center. Judge Morrison. She recognized him from a photo in a program. Leaned forward slightly. He was an older man, with sharp features and thin wire-frame glasses. He was famous, a concert pianist whose recordings she had listened to on scratchy CDs from the library. "La Campanella," he repeated, his tone flat. He glanced down at his paper, then back up at her. "That is a very demanding choice, Miss Vance, finger breaker, as we say. Are you quite certain?" It wasn't a question of concern. It was a challenge, a test. The unspoken words hung in the air. "For someone like you?" Alara felt a hot prickling at the back of her neck. She simply nodded. "Yes, sir." The judge on the left, a woman with a severe gray bun, gave a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Proceed when ready." Alara turned and walked to the piano. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever touched. She gently lowered herself onto the bench, which was firm and steady, not like the wobbly one at the community center. She arranged the folds of her dress, a habit. She placed her hands in her lap, staring at the perfect, ivory-white keys. They were a blank landscape. For a second, The silence was so complete she could hear the faint hum of the lights above. This was it. This was the moment her 10 years of work, of dreaming in a room that smelled of damp and brass polish, was supposed to lead to. She lifted her hands, the boatyard hands, and placed them over the keys, and then she played. The first few notes were fine, clean, but as she launched into the first rapid run, the nerves she had swallowed down erupted. Her right hand, usually so reliable, stumbled. The notes clumped together, a messy smudge of sound instead of a sparkling cascade. She gasped inwardly, forced herself forward, but the mistake threw her rhythm off. She hit a wrong note in the next chord, a loud, ugly asterisk clang asterisk that seemed to vibrate in the hushed room. She stopped. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought they could hear it. From the shadows, she heard a whisper. It was meant to be private, but the room's acoustics carried it perfectly to her ears. It was Judge Morrison's voice, dry and dripping with disappointment, confidence. He murmured to his colleague, "Built on sand. A shame." The words landed like physical blows. Asterisk confidence built on sand. Asterisk in Sebring. They knew all about sand. It got into everything, shifted under your feet, eroded the strongest stone. It was the opposite of foundation. For a second, Elara wanted to disappear, to get up, mutter an apology, and flee back through the heavy doors, back to the world of engines and salt spray where she belonged. The heat in her neck flushed into her cheeks. The grand piano felt like a trap, a shiny joke she'd been foolish to approach. She kept her head down, staring at her flawed, traitorous hands on the perfect keys. The judge's whisper echoed, asterisk sand, asterisk, but then another sound pushed it out. It wasn't in the room. It was in her memory. It was the deep, shuddering asterisk thump dash thump asterisk of the boatyard's main diesel engine. A sound so constant you felt it in your teeth. It was the rhythm of her life. Underneath that, the high, lonely cry of a seagull fighting the wind. The metallic asterisk clang asterisk of a hammer on hull, not so different from that wrong note. The shushing roar of the waves. The judge's silence wasn't judgment anymore. It was just another kind of noise. The quiet of the hall was not respectful. It was empty. It was waiting to be filled. Her teacher's voice came to her then, not from the lighthouse cottage, but from deep inside. They will listen with their ears. Elara, you must play for them with your bones. Play the sea. She closed her eyes. She wasn't in the Royal Northern Conservatory. She was on the breakwater, the cold spray on her face. The piano in front of her wasn't a grand piano. It was the old, buzzy upright, its chipped keys familiar as the faces in her town. The judges were just shadows, no more intimidating than the clouds gathering before a storm. She took a breath, deeper this time, filling her lungs. She let her shoulders drop. The mistake was gone. The whisper was gone. There was only the rhythm of the water, and the music waiting in her hands. She opened her eyes. Her gaze was clear, focused on a point far beyond the back wall of the room. Her fingers found their starting position again, and she began, not for the second time, but for the first true time. The air in the hall was still thick with the echo of the wrong note. It hung there, a clumsy, honest mistake. Elara's hands froze over the keys. In the silence that followed, she could feel the weight of the judge's attention, but it had changed. It was no longer bored or impatient. It had sharpened into a kind of quiet, pitying focus. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. The girl from nowhere, who dared to choose a mountain of a piece, was about to crumble on the slopes. The whisper from the shadowed table asterisk confidence built on sand asterisk did not make her angry. It acted like a key, turning in a lock deep inside her. It unlocked a door, and instead of fear, a strange calm flooded out, because she knew sand. She knew the gritty feel of it between her fingers after a morning on the beach. She knew how it could shift and slide, making you stumble, but she also knew what lay beneath it. In Sebring, if you dug down through the sand, you hit solid rock, cold, wet, ancient granite. That was what her town was built on. That was what her life was built on. The judge, with his perfect world of polished concert halls, only saw the shifting surface. He didn't know about the rock below. Her mind left the room. It traveled back, not in a blur, but with a slow, sure step. It went past the long train, journeyed to the city, past the intimidating stone facade of the conservatory. It went home. Suddenly, she wasn't hearing the tense quiet of the audition hall. She was hearing the boatyard. It wasn't one sound, but a symphony of rough, real noise. The deep, grumbling asterisk thud dash thud asterisk of the big diesel engine in the workshop. a rhythm so deep you felt it in your chest before you heard it. It was the bass line of her days, over the top, the sharp, high asterisk ping asterisk of a hammer on metal, and the long, shrieking protest of a power saw cutting through steel plate. Men's voices shouted over the din, not angry, just loud and full of purpose. Heave secure that line, mind your hands, and beneath it all, always, the sea. Not the gentle lapping of a pond, but the huge, breathing presence of the ocean. The crash of a big wave against the stone pier, a low boom that shook the windows of the office. The endless, sighing pull of the water retreating over a million pebbles. The lonely, crying wind in the rigging of the boats hauled up on the slipway. This was her practice room. This was the noise she had learned to play through. The buzz of the community center's old piano was just another instrument in this orchestra. She would play, and from the yard outside, through the thin walls, would come the clatter and roar. She'd learned to make her music not in spite of it, but asterisk with asterisk it. The rumbling engine became a deep left-hand chord. The cry of a gull became a high, singing note. The crash of a wave was her crescendo. The judge's doubt, their whispering, was just another kind of engine noise. It was a distraction, but not a new one. She knew how to tune it out. She opened her eyes. She looked down at her hands on the keys. They weren't trembling anymore. They looked like what they were, strong, capable hands. Hands that could pull a rope, sand a piece of wood, and now, play the piano. The scar on her knuckle gleamed in the spotlight. She began again. This time, it was different. It didn't start with a nervous sparkle. It started with a deep, resonant note from the left hand, firm and grounded, like the first heavy drop of rain before a storm. Then the right hand came in, not with the rushed, fizzy run she'd attempted before, but with a clear, deliberate pattern. The notes were perfectly spaced, like bells ringing across a windy harbor. She wasn't playing the notes on the page for the judges anymore. She was translating her world. The famously difficult jumping patterns in the piece, where the right hand has to leap from one end of the keyboard to the other, became something new. In her mind, they weren't just technical tricks. They were the flash of a silver fish leaping from a wave, the sudden arc of a tool thrown from one worker to another, the dizzying flight of a bird catching an updraft over the cliffs. Her strong arms, used to real work, moved with a powerful, fluid grace. The jumps were not frantic. They were sure and sweeping. The soft, lyrical middle section, where many players tried to be delicate and sweet, changed in her hands. It became slow and vast. The melody unfolded like a wide, calm sea under a gray sky, full of depth and a little sadness. It was the sound of the horizon, empty and full of promise at the same time. It was the quiet moment at the end of the dock, looking out. Then, she built it back up, the trills, those fast, shaking notes that are meant to sound like little bells, did not just tinkle. Under her fingers, they shimmered and multiplied. They became the sunlight catching on a million shifting wavelets. They became the spray of salt water in the air, glittering and cold on your face. She played louder, deeper. The thunderous octaves in the bass were not just loud notes. They were the diesel engine. They were the hull of a trawler grinding against the pier. They were the deep, awesome power of the ocean itself, a force that could lift boats and smash them. The grand piano, this instrument of refined concert halls, groaned and roared under her hands like a living thing. The very air in the room seemed to vibrate. She forgot about technique. She forgot about impressing anyone. She was just telling the story of where she was from, the beauty and the toughness, the loneliness and the community, the constant fight and the endless peace. It was all in the music. At the judge's table, everything had stopped. The woman with the gray bun had stopped writing. Her pen was frozen in midair, a drop of ink slowly gathering at its tip. Forgotten, she was staring, her mouth slightly open, not at Alara's hands, but at a point in the space between her and the piano, as if she could see the pictures Alara was painting. The judge on the right, who had sighed, was sitting perfectly still. He had taken off his glasses and was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. His eyes were wide, following the blur of her movement, listening to a sound he had never heard before, not in all his years of teaching and judging. And Judge Morrison, in the center, the man who had whispered the cutting remark. His face had gone through a journey. First, there was surprise that she had started again. Then, a flicker of continued skepticism. But as the music transformed, that skepticism melted away, replaced by a look of intense, focused concentration. His eyebrows, which had been raised in disdain, were now drawn together. He was not just listening. He was asterisk decoding asterisk. He was hearing Liszt's La Campanella, yes, but he was hearing it played as if the composer had written it not in a grand salon, but on a stormy coast. The color, the weight, the sheer physicality of it was shocking. His earlier words, confidence built on sand, echoed now in his own mind, and they tasted bitter. This was not sand. This was granite. This was bedrock. This young woman was not trying to impress him with fancy tricks. She was showing him her soul, and it was as vast and wild and beautiful as the sea. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his own neck. He had judged the cover, and he had been utterly, completely wrong. He looked down at his notes, at the sharp, critical comments he had begun to write after her first false start. They looked stupid now, small and mean on the page. He slowly closed the folder, pushing it away. He didn't need notes for this. All three of them were just passengers now, being carried away by a tide of sound. The hall was no longer an audition room. It had become a vessel, and Alara was steering it through deep water, under open skies, towards a shore they had never seen. The music wasn't just coming from the piano anymore. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air in the hall. It filled every corner, not as a loud noise, but as a presence, a living, breathing thing. Alara was its heart. Her body moved with the rhythm of it, not with dramatic swings, but with the sure, economical movements of someone used to real work. A lean into a deep chord, a swift recoil for a leap across the keys, a gentle sway during the quiet, haunting parts that sounded like fog rolling over the water. The judges had stopped being judges. They had become listeners, captive witnesses for the woman with the gray bun. The music pulled a memory loose. She hadn't thought of it in 30 years. Suddenly, she wasn't in the conservatory. She was a girl again, standing on a pebble beach in the west of Ireland, visiting her grandmother. The air was cold and tasted of salt. The gray sea and the gray sky met in a blur. She'd found a small, white shell, perfect and smooth, and held it to her ear, listening to the hollow roar. This music right now was that sound. It was the cold, beautiful loneliness of that coastline. It was a feeling she had packed away when she chose a life of theory and technique in competitions. A sharp, unexpected pang of homesickness for a place that wasn't even her home hit her square in the chest. Her eyes, usually so sharp and critical, glistened. She didn't blink, afraid the spell would break. The judge on the right, the one who had sighed, heard something else entirely. He was a man who loved structure, who found beauty in the perfect mathematical precision of a Bach fugue. What he was hearing now should have been chaos. It was too big, too emotional, too raw. But it wasn't chaotic. It was a different kind of order. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he didn't see sheet music. He saw patterns. The rapid, glittering high notes were like the complex foam patterns left on the sand as a wave retreated. The powerful bass chords were the regular, pulsing crash of the waves themselves, nature's own relentless rhythm. He realized, with a shock, that this girl was playing the physics of the coast, the erosion, the tide, the constant change within a perfect cycle. His analytical mind, which had dismissed her at first, was now racing, trying to map the wild beauty of her playing onto a grid, and failing wonderfully. A small, unconscious smile touched his lips. This was why he loved music. For the moments it surprised you. And Judge Morrison, he was fighting it. Or, he had been. A part of him, the proud, established part, wanted to cling to his first impression, to find a flaw, a missed note, a moment of impurity in her technique. But the music was a flood, and it was washing all that away. He had performed this very piece, decades ago, in his own scholarship audition. He had played it with flawless clarity and impressive speed. He had won. He had built a career on that kind of precision. But listening now, he felt a hollow space open up inside him. His performance, all those years ago, had been a brilliant reproduction, a perfect copy of a great painting. What this young woman was doing was taking the same paints and creating a completely new picture, one full of storms and sunlight and deep, cold water. She wasn't copying Liszt. She was conversing with him, arguing with him, telling him a new story. The piece was no longer La Campanella. It was Sebring. His shame deepened, but it mixed with a soaring, thrilling feeling he hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of discovery, of hearing something truly new. He watched her hands. They weren't the long, slender fingers of the textbook pianist. They were stronger, with a wider span. They didn't dance over the keys. They commanded them. They pulled the sound out of the piano, like a fisherman hauling in a net full of gleaming, silvery fish. The scar on her knuckle flashed under the light, a badge of a life lived outside of practice rooms. Elara was far away. The spotlight on her was the cold sun breaking through clouds. The smooth wood of the piano was the weathered rail of the old pier, worn smooth by generations of hands. The pedals under her feet were the creaking boards of the fishing boat she sometimes went out on. She was playing for the old man who ran the boatyard, who let her practice in the community center in exchange for helping tidy up. She was playing for her mom, who worked in the fish packing plant and always came home smelling of the sea, her hands red from cold water. She was playing for the lonely, vast sky above her town. She reached the final section, the most treacherous part. It was a whirlwind, a storm of notes where both hands had to work in furious, independent unison. Most players tensed up here. They fought the piano, their faces tight with effort. Elara's face was calm. There was a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, but her expression was one of fierce joy. This was the storm. This was the gale whipping the harbor into a frenzy. The rain hitting the windows horizontally, the boats straining at their ropes. Her arms and shoulders, strengthened by hauling ropes and pushing carts, powered through the complexity with a raw, unleashed strength. The notes weren't just fast. They were powerful, each one a drop of rain in a hurricane. The piano shook. The music wasn't pretty anymore. It was glorious and terrifying, a force of nature right there in the quiet, polished room. And then, it crested. The music climbed to its highest, brightest point, a series of ringing, bell-like chords that shone like a sudden shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. It was the moment the wind drops, and the world holds its breath. She held the last, shimmering chord, her foot on the sustain pedal, letting the sound bloom and fill every last inch of space. Then, with a final, gentle movement of her fingers, she released the keys. Silence. But it was a completely different silence than before. The first silence had been empty, waiting to be filled. This silence was full. It was heavy with the echo of everything that had just happened. It was a respectful silence, an odd silence. The final notes seemed to hang in the air, slowly dissolving like mist. Elara let her hands fall into her lap. She looked down at them, her breath coming in deep, quiet pulls. She felt utterly spent, but clean, like after a long walk on a windy cliff. The world of the boatyard faded. The feel of the pier under her feet softened back into the solid floor of the hall. The salt air was just a memory on her tongue. She slowly became aware of the room again, the heat of the spotlight, the dark shapes of the judges beyond the light. She didn't look up at them. A wave of exhaustion, and the return of a nervous flutter, passed through her. It was over. She had given it everything. There was nothing left in her. At the table, no one moved. No one reached for a pen. No one whispered. The judge with the gray bun slowly, quietly, laid her pen down on the table. It made no sound. She brought her hands together in her lap, folding them neatly. The judge on the right let out a long, slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He opened his eyes, looking at the young woman at the piano as if seeing her for the very first time. Judge Morrison finally moved. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking softly. The sound was huge in the quiet. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with his thumb and forefinger. When he put them back on, his face was different. The lines of habitual criticism were gone, smoothed away by wonder and something else. Something like regret, an immense respect. He looked at the girl, sitting so still on the bench, waiting. He knew what usually happened next. He would say, "Thank you," in a neutral voice. He might ask a technical question. They would make their notes, and the next candidate would be called. But this was not a usual audition. What had just happened could not be followed by a simple thank you. It demanded something more. It demanded an acknowledgement. The heavy silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10. It wasn't awkward. It was necessary. It was the time needed for the world to slot back into place. Elara, feeling the weight of the quiet, finally lifted her head. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked toward the shadowed table, not at any one judge, but at the space they occupied. She was ready for whatever came next, ready for the polite dismissal or the critical feedback. She had said what she needed to say. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. The sound was rough, gravelly with emotion he was trying to control. He opened his mouth to speak. No words came out at first. He tried again. "Miss Vance," he began, and his voice, once so crisp and dismissive, was now quiet, almost gentle. Miss Vance, her name, spoken into that full silence, sounded different. It wasn't the sharp clip of an official calling a number. It was softer. It had weight. Elara kept her eyes on the shadowy figures, her hands still folded in her lap. The part of her that was still the girl from the boatyard braced for the polite letdown. Asterisk very passionate, but technically unorthodox. Not quite what we're looking for, asterisk, but the words didn't come. Judge Morrison seemed to be searching for them. He looked down at his closed folder, then back at her. The other two judges remained motionless, giving him the space. This was his moment. They seemed to feel it. He was the one who had spoken the cutting remark. He was the one who needed to find the new language. That was, he started again, then stopped. He took a breath, a real, deep breath, as if he himself had just finished playing. I have been listening to auditions in this hall for 22 years, he paused, letting the number sit there. It was a lifetime. It was longer than Alara had been alive. I have heard La Campanella performed, he continued, his voice gaining a little steadiness, 47 times. Perhaps more. He gave a small, almost helpless shake of his head. What you just did was not a performance. Alara felt a cold drop in her stomach. Here it was. The rejection. She lowered her gaze to the black and white keys. Her fortress, now silent. It was a transport, he said, the word feeling strange in his mouth. You did not play that piece for us. You brought your world into this room and you played asterisk that asterisk. You played the wind. You played the deep water. I heard the engine of a boat in your left hand. Alara's head came up slowly. She looked at him, trying to see his expression in the dim light beyond her spotlight. The judge with the gray bun finally moved. She nodded once, a sharp, definite motion. The cold, she said, her own voice husky. There was a cold, clean beauty in the middle section. It wasn't sentimental. It was true. It was the beauty of an empty beach in winter. The third judge chimed in, his analytical tone now full of warmth. The rhythmic structure in the final presto. It wasn't just metric. It was tidal. You understand. The push and pull. It was physics. They were talking to each other, but about her. Alara sat, listening, trying to understand. This wasn't criticism. It wasn't praise for being good. It was something else. They were describing what they'd seen and felt, like people describing a dream. Judge Morrison held up a hand, gently quieting the others. He focused on Alara. May I ask, he began, then reconsidered. Would you tell us? How, where did that interpretation come from? It was the question, the one that moved past how long have you practiced and went straight to the heart. Alara was silent for a moment. The hall waited. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by a kind of hungry curiosity. She thought of the community center, the buzzy middle sea, the view from its high, grimy window of the gray slate roof of the fish market. She thought of her teacher, whose hands shook with age now, showing her how to shape a phrase not just correctly, but meaningfully. It's where I practice, she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. It's in a community hall, next to the boatyard. She saw them lean forward slightly. There's always noise, she continued, feeling her way through the explanation. Big engines, men shouting, the sea. My piano is old. Some of the keys don't work right, she swallowed. So I couldn't really play to be quiet or perfect. I had to play to be heard. Over all of that, I had to play something that fit with the noise, or made sense of it. She looked at her hands, then back at them. The piece, when I first learned it, it was just notes. Fast, hard notes. But then, it started to sound like the rest of my life. The jumping notes were like the gulls. The loud, deep parts were the waves on the stones. The quiet parts were the fog in the morning. I just stopped trying to play it like the recordings. I started playing it like it was about my home, she finished, feeling suddenly shy. It sounded so simple when she said it out loud, almost silly. But the judges didn't think it was silly. The woman with the bun was nodding slowly, a look of deep understanding on her face. The man on the right was jotting down a note, not a critique, but an idea, a spark. Judge Morrison did something then that no candidate in that hall had ever seen him do. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly on the wooden floor. He stood up. He didn't come around the table. He stayed behind it, but he rose to his full height, a tall, slender figure in the shadows. It was an act of respect, a gesture that broke every protocol of the detached, formal audition. Miss Vance, he said, his voice firm now, filled with a conviction that erased any last trace of his earlier scorn. What you possess is what we spend our careers trying to teach, and so rarely find. Technique can be drilled, fingers can be trained, but what you have, that voice, that cannot be manufactured. It is learned by living a real life. It is earned. He glanced at his colleagues. They both gave him a slight, confirming nod. This was not a decision to be debated later in private. This was evident, here and now. The senior scholarship, he said, turning his gaze back to Alara, who had gone very still, is not merely a financial grant. It is a commitment from this institution to an artist we believe can shape the future of music. It provides full tuition, a living stipend, mentorship, and a place in our most advanced performance program. He paused, letting the description hang. It was everything. It was the key to the world behind the heavy doors. It is offered to one student each year. He took a step closer to the edge of the light. We would be honored, Miss Vance, if you would accept it. The words didn't make sense at first. They were too big. They floated in the air around her, and she couldn't grasp them. Asterisk offered, except asterisk they were about her. The silence that followed was absolute, waiting for her answer. Her mind went blank. She thought of her mom, who would be finishing her shift at the packing plant right now, her back aching. She thought of the old piano in the community center. She thought of the scholarship application form, filled out at the small kitchen table, the hope feeling dangerous even to write down. A warmth began to spread through her chest, pushing out the cold knot of anxiety. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the thrill of winning. It was a deep, profound relief. It was the feeling of being seen. Not just her fingers, but her heart. Not just her sound, but her story. She found her voice. It was a whisper, but it carried. Yes, she said. Then, stronger. Yes, thank you. Judge Morrison nodded, a slow, grave movement. He finally stepped into the edge of the spotlight and did something even more extraordinary. He began to clap. Not the polite, three-pat applause of an audition panel. A real, resonant, steady applause. The other two judges rose to their feet and joined him. The sound was rich and warm in the hall, echoing off the walls. It was not for a flawless performance. It was for a journey. It was for the boatyard, and the old piano, and the girl who had brought the sea into the room and made them all feel its depth. Alara sat on the bench, the applause washing over her. She didn't smile a big, celebratory smile. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path down her cheek, but her expression was one of quiet astonishment. She looked from one standing judge to another, seeing their faces clearly now for the first time, not as imposing authorities, but as people, moved and humbled. The judge with the gray bun was smiling, a real, wide smile that transformed her face. The analytical judge was clapping with gusto, his earlier reserve gone. And Judge Morrison, as he clapped, he looked directly at her, and in his eyes, there was an unspoken message, an apology, a welcome, a recognition. It was all there. Finally, he lowered his hands. The applause faded. There will be forms, he said, his tone returning to something more practical, but now infused with a new kindness. And many people for you to meet. But for now, Miss Vance, welcome. You may step outside. We will send someone for you shortly to begin the process. Alara stood up. Her legs felt a little shaky. She gave a small, awkward nod to the three judges, who remained standing. Then she turned and walked away from the grand piano, across the wooden floor, towards the heavy doors. As she reached for the handle, she glanced back once. The three figures were still standing behind their table, watching her go. The spotlight was now shining on an empty bench. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the bright, mundane light of the corridor. The door swung shut behind her, muffling the world she had just left, the world she had just entered. She leaned against the cool wall for a moment, closing her eyes. She could still feel the vibration of the piano in her bones. She could still hear the ghost of the applause. But louder than both was the sound of her own breath, steady and sure, and the distant, imagined crash of waves on the shore of home. The corridor outside the audition hall was a different planet. The light was flat and bright from fluorescent tubes overhead, not a warm, focused spotlight. The air smelled of floor cleaner and old books, not of salt and roaring engines. Alara stood with her back against the cool wall, the solid wood of the door pressing through her dress. She could still feel the vibration of the final, shimmering chord in the tips of her fingers. A phantom echo. Her heart was no longer hammering. It was beating a slow, heavy, wondrous rhythm, like a calm sea after a storm. From inside the hall, there was only silence. No more music, no more talking. It was over. A door further down the corridor opened, and a tired-looking woman with a clipboard peered out. Candidate 148, you're next. A boy with slicked back hair and a nervous smile stood up from a plastic chair and straightened his tie. He walked past Alara, without really seeing her, his own fears and hopes written all over his face. He disappeared into the hall, The door shut with a soft, solid thud. Life was already moving on. The great machine of the audition day was continuing. But for her, everything had stopped and then started again on a new, unimaginable track. She pushed herself away from the wall and walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps quiet on the linoleum. She found the small waiting area where she had sat for an hour earlier, her stomach in knots. She sank into the same plastic chair. It felt different now. It felt like a chair in a spaceship, resting on a new world. The words played in a loop in her head. Asterisk, we would be honored if you would accept it. Asterisk, and her own voice, small but sure. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk, a bubble of something wild and disbelieving rose in her chest. She pressed her lips together to keep it in. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. The same hands that had sanded the rough edges off a piece of driftwood for her teacher just last week. The same hands that had tied complex knots on the dock. They had just been offered a key, not just to a school, but to a future she had only let herself dream about in her darkest, most private moments. She thought of her mother. A wave of fierce love and aching sadness hit her. She would have to leave. The scholarship came with a room in the city. Seaburn, with its crashing waves and shouting men and the smell of fish and diesel, would become the place she visited. Home. But not home in the same way. It was a bittersweet price, and she felt its weight even in the joy. About 15 minutes later, the door to the inner offices opened. It wasn't the clipboard woman. It was Judge Morrison himself. He looked different in the plain light of the corridor. Older, a little more tired, but the stern lines of his face had softened. He held a thin folder. He saw her sitting there and gave a small, brief nod. Miss Vance, would you come with me, please? She stood, smoothing her dress, and followed him. He didn't lead her back into the audition hall, but down a quieter, side corridor lined with portraits of severe-looking men and women from centuries past. They ended up in a small, sunlit office, messy with scores and coffee mugs. It was his. She realized. Please, sit, he said, gesturing to a chair. He didn't sit behind the big desk, but pulled a wooden chair around to sit near her. It was a conscious effort to be less formal. He opened the folder. The paperwork will take a few days to finalize, but the decision is made. This, he said, tapping a line on the top document, is the commitment, full tuition, for the entire 4-year program. And this, he tapped another, is the living stipend. It's enough for a modest room and food. You won't need to work, except at your music. He said it carefully, watching her. He was offering her time, the most precious gift, time she had never had. There will be expectations, he continued, his tone frank but not harsh. Very high ones. You have a raw, extraordinary gift, but your technique, in the traditional sense, has gaps, places where the boatyard strength is a benefit, and places where it might need refinement. You will have to work, harder than you ever have. Elara nodded. I know how to work, she said quietly. A faint smile touched his lips. Yes, I believe you do. He paused, looking out the window for a moment. What you did in there, you must understand, it was not just good. It was a rebuke, to me. He looked back at her, his gaze direct and honest. I saw a girl in a second-hand dress and I assumed poverty of spirit. I was ashamed the moment you played the first true note. You taught an old man a very important lesson today. Thank you for that. Elara didn't know what to say. She just nodded again, accepting his words. Your teacher, he said, changing the subject. In Seaburn, I must write to them. They have done a remarkable thing, not by giving you perfect technique, but by protecting that voice inside you. He's old, Elara said, her own voice thick suddenly. He'll be so pleased. Good, Judge Morrison said. He closed the folder and handed it to her. This is for you to look over. Take it home, show your family. There are numbers to call with questions. He stood up. The term begins in 6 weeks. We will be in touch before then to arrange everything. She stood, holding the folder as if it were made of gold leaf. It felt like a contract with a new life. He walked her to the office door. As she was about to step out, he spoke once more, a piece of advice. From someone who has listened to too much perfect, empty music. Don't let them smooth out the rough edges, not all of them. The sea is not smooth, the wind is not smooth. That is where your power comes from. Remember the noise of the boatyard. You will need it here. In the quiet, she met his eyes. I will, she said, and she knew she meant it. The train ride back to Seaburn was a blur of green fields and graying sky. The folder sat on her lap, unopened. She needed to be home to look at it, to make it real. When the train finally pulled into the small station, the first thing she heard was the distant deep blast of a ship's horn from the harbor. It sounded like a welcome. She walked from the station, the salt air filling her lungs, familiar and sharp. The sounds wrapped around her, the clang of rigging, the shout of a news vendor, the low gossip of the waves. She went straight to the community center. It was locked, but she had a key. She led herself into the small, damp-smelling hall. There stood her piano, the old, scarred upright with the buzzing middle C in the dim light from the high windows. It looked small, humble. It was the most important thing in the world. She didn't play Liszt. She sat down and played a simple, quiet folk tune she'd learned as a child. The notes were soft in the empty room. She played it for the piano itself. A thank you, a goodbye of sorts. Later, at home, she showed her mother the folder. They sat at the small kitchen table, the one where she'd done her homework and filled out the application. Her mother's hands, red and chapped from the cold fish packing line, traced over the words of the scholarship offer. She didn't cry. She squeezed Alara's hand so tight it hurt. "My girl," was all she could say, over and over. "My brilliant girl." The news traveled through Seaburn fast. The girl from the boatyard who'd won the big city scholarship. The old man who had taught her wept unashamedly when Judge Morrison's letter arrived, calling him a guardian of a rare flame. The fishermen at the yard clapped her on the back, their hands like slabs of stone, and told her not to get too fancy for them. The day she left, 6 weeks later, was bright and windy. She stood on the platform with one small suitcase and a backpack. Her mother held her face in both hands, looked into her eyes, and kissed her forehead. "Send us the music," she whispered. On the train, as the town shrank into a smudge of gray stone and blue sea behind her, Alara opened her backpack. Inside, wrapped in an old jumper, was a small, smooth, gray stone from the beach, and a photo of the old upright piano in the community center. She was going to a world of quiet practice rooms and grand pianos and critical master classes. She was ready to work. She was ready to learn. But she knew, deep in her bones, that her real instrument was not just the piano. It was the memory of the storm, the rhythm of the engine, the taste of salt, the feel of granite beneath the sand. They were the notes on her invisible staff, the source of her silence and her song. The train carried her forward, into her future, but the tide of home would always pull within her, keeping her steady, keeping her true. The girl from the boatyard was gone, and yet she would always be right here, in every note she was yet to play.